question that we're interested in investigating in this paper is the following. How does a permanent positive productivity shock impact conflict? If you look at the literature, it typically analyzes short-lived shocks. So for example, literature argues that a short-lived positive productivity shock ought to increase the opportunity costs of fighting relative to engaging in productive economic activity, and therefore that should reduce conflict. And so what we want to ask here is, does the impact of a permanent shock differ? And to make progress on this question, we're going to study the impact of a major historical permanent shock, namely the introduction of New World crops after 1500 in Asia. Asia, of course, is home to more than half of the world's population, both historically and also today. The principal data contribution of this paper is the conflict data. Specifically, we geocode the locations of all the conflicts in Asia as defined by the United Nations. Those are the borders that we're working with here for Asia. Between the years 1000 and 1900, the main source for these conflict data is a book by Jacques, but we're also going to use multiple additional sources for robustness. And I'll say more about the conflict data ahead. What we're going to do with these conflict data is map them into 1 degree by 1 degree grid cells by century. So 1 degree by 1 degree is roughly 110 kilometers by 110 kilometers at the equator. And then we're going to merge these conflict data with data on caloric suitability from Galore and Ozak. And in essence, these data measure potential crop yields before and after 1500. That is, before and after the onset of the Columbian exchange. And I'll have more to say about these data ahead. In terms of analysis, we're going to use difference in difference and event study specifications. And what we're going to find is that grid cells which gained in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange experienced a significant increase. So not a decrease, but an increase in conflict, including civil conflict. And we're going to show you that the magnitude is rather sizable. Here's one way to think about it. The mean gain in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange increased conflict by roughly its mean. And then what I'm going to do today is show you that this main result is robust in a variety of ways. I'll say more about that ahead. And what we're going to argue is that the mechanism that best explains this result, at least in our view, is a rapacity effect. And in essence, a rapacity effect refers to a rise in the gains of appropriation from political actors in the areas that saw an increase in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange. And I'll flesh out this idea in a couple of slides. We're going to show evidence in support of this rapacity effect, and then we're going to rule out some alternative mechanisms. So we think that this project makes a variety of contributions. The first concerns the literature that I mentioned at the outset on short-lived productivity shock. So again, the idea here is that if you experience a short-lived positive productivity shock, that should increase the opportunity cost of fighting relative to any rapacity effect that's out there, and that should reduce the incidence of conflict. So with respect to this part of the literature, we're going to study a permanent productivity shock, not a short-lived one, and we're going to show that, at least in this context, the rapacity effect can prevail. Now, there is a related literature on rapacity effects for short-lived shocks, and again, with respect to this part of the literature, we're going to study a permanent shock. And we're going to highlight how changes in settlement patterns, a sort of a different aspect of the rapacity effect, can drive the results that we're seeing. Now, there is a small literature on permanent productivity shocks. There's 2 papers that are closely related to ours. The first is by Eagan and co-authors. It's a working paper published in 2019. And what they find is that the introduction of the white potato due to the Columbian exchange reduced conflict in Europe, the Near East, and North Africa. And then the second paper is one by Jia, published in the Economic Journal in 2014. And she finds that the introduction of the sweet potato into China reduced or mitigated the effect of bad weather on peasant revolts. So with respect to these two important papers, we're going to study a range of crops, not just one, across the whole of Asia. And in contrast to these two papers, we're going to find an increase in conflict. We're going to put forth a new mechanism, namely the rapacity effect, to explain that. Now, there's a related literature on the Columbian exchange. And one thing that this literature finds is that the introduction of New World crops, such as the potato or maize, was associated with significant increases in population and urbanization in different world regions, including Europe, Africa, and then the country of China. And so what we're going to do with respect to this literature is link changes in settlement patterns that have been documented to greater conflict, and that's within the context of Asia. We're also going to show that this increase in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange was associated with a higher likelihood of violent occupation by British imperialists. And so we think that this angle sheds new light on the great divergence in historic socioeconomic outcomes between Europe and Asia, which is arguably a process in which imperialism has arguably played a role. And then finally, there's another literature on the political economy of historical conflict. And with respect to this literature, we're going to study the impact of permanent shock in the context of Asia. So let me tell you a bit more about our conceptual framework, and in particular about this rapacity effect. So the idea here is that if an area experiences an increase in caloric suitability, for example, due to the Columbian exchange, then we might expect to observe in response increases in population and urbanization. And in response to that, we might think that political actors now have new incentives to gain control over the now more valuable contestable resources. So these resources include people, they also might include land. And so that might give rise to more conflict. If this rapacity effect mechanism is correct, then we ought to observe a bunch of different testable implications. And that's what we're going to look for in the empirical analysis ahead. So first off, obviously, we should expect to observe increases in both population and urbanization due to the increase in caloric suitability coming from the Columbian exchange. We might also expect to observe an increase in violent imperial occupation. Another implication is that a rapacity effect, we might think, would be most evident in regions with high political competition on the eve of the Columbian exchange, okay? Less evident in regions with a hegemonic power. We might also think that the rapacity effect should hold for a variety of productivity improving crops. Any sort of productivity improving crop that can alter settlement patterns can sort of enable a rapacity effect. This is different than some other effects, which I'll talk about, such as state making, which we might think would be more evident for particular sorts of crops that are easily taxable. I mentioned before the sweet potato and drought resistance. So that's not sort of going on here, we don't think. Similarly, we might expect that this would hold for a variety of conflict types. And then a final implication is that if you do observe increases in population and urbanization in response to this increase in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange, you might think that's going to engender a variety of new interactions between different groups, including trade, and that might raise conflict. And you might think that this would be most evident in regions with high intragroup and intergroup diversity. So that's another thing that we're going to test. Now let's think about some alternative mechanisms here as well that could plausibly be in play. So the first is something I've talked about already, which is the opportunity cost mechanism. The idea here, again, is that if there's an increase in caloric suitability in a certain area, that should drop food prices in that area, which amounts to an increase in real wages, which then should make the opportunity cost of fighting higher and therefore should reduce conflict. I've also mentioned, alluded to at least, this second alternative mechanism, which would be the moderation of weather shock. So let's take something like the potato. If that was introduced, we know that it's resistant to cold weather. Okay, so that can mitigate the effect of winter. It can reduce starvation. And so you might think that that's going to be associated with less civil conflict. Similarly, with the introduction of the potato, sweet potato, which is drought resistant, that might reduce the amount of droughts, thereby reduce human suffering and make it less likely we're going to observe civil conflict. Another mechanism, which I alluded to on the previous slide, has to do with state making. And so here the idea is if you get an increase in caloric suitability, you might think that improves output of crops, which means that the state can gather more revenue, and then the state can use that higher revenue to wage war. So if this is true, then we might think that it would be most evident for crops that can be taxed, things like cereals and grains. Now, on the other hand, tubers have been identified in the literature as escape crops. I'm thinking of work by James Scott on this topic, which require less organizational structure. So require less collective action in order to cultivate tubers. Tubers include things like potatoes and sweet potatoes and cassava. And so we might think that tubers would be less predictive of conflict because a state-making mechanism would be less likely to kick in. And then finally, there's a couple of mechanisms associated with inequality, and these could actually run both ways. So let's say that there's more potato cultivation due to the Columbian exchange. Well, the potato can be cultivated in sort of poor agricultural areas. It can be cultivated on small plots. That might conceivably raise the living standards of the poor, which can reduce inequality, which you might think would be associated with less civil conflict. If, however, the introduction of New World crops, in particular cereals and grains, led to greater state making, as I mentioned on this point here, then that might create sort of more of a political hierarchy. You have a development of a new political elite, which can increase inequality, and that might be associated with more civil conflict. Okay, so now let me tell you about our identification strategy, and then I'm going to tell you more about the data and the historical background before we go to the main results. So the main identification strategy is a difference in difference one, where our outcome variable is going to be the number of conflict starts in a 1 degree by 1 degree grid cell in a century. And then our variable of interest here is going to be the caloric suitability index. Prior to 1500, it's based on old world crops only. From 1500 onwards, it's based on all crops, including the new world crops. We're always going to include grid cell and century fixed effects. And then what we're also going to do is interact in the baseline pre-1500 caloric suitability in a grid cell with a dummy for the post-1500 period. Okay? And the idea there is that's going to help us account for unobserved time-varying heterogeneity. Now, for robustness, we're going to interact a bunch of other time invariant controls with this post-1500 dummy, and I'll talk about those ahead. And then the standard errors are clustered by grid cells in the baseline. Now, we're also going to use event studies here. The thing that changes here is that we're going to use a different variable of interest. Namely, now we're going to focus on the change in caloric suitability in a grid cell after 1500 due to the introduction of New World crops. And what we're going to do is interact that treatment with century fixed effects, okay, whereby we drop 1400 as the excluded category. And then similarly, we're going to interact time invariant controls with those century fixed effects. And in the baseline, as in the difference in difference specification, it's only going to include pre-1500 caloric suitability in a grid cell. Okay, so again, before moving on to the results, let me tell you about the data. So for the conflict data, which is our principal data contribution, we're going to rely on a book by Jacques who provides descriptions of individual battles. And what we're going to do is geocode each conflict location by the settlement nearest to where it took place. We're also going to code a variety of other characteristics of each conflict. And that's going to yield more than 1,350 recorded conflicts between the years 1000 and 1900. Now, to double check this coverage, we're going to construct alternative conflict data from a variety of sources. For China, we're going to take data from the Nanjing Military Academy study. For India, we're going to take it from two sources. Naravain is more of a local source and Clodfelter is more of a global source. And then for Turkey, we're going to take the data from two sort of global sources. One is Clodfelter, as I mentioned, the other is another source called Bradbury. And what we're going to do there is add any non-overlapping conflicts from these alternative data sources to the JOC data for robustness. So let me give you an example of our coding methodology in the JOC data. So this is the Battle of Peshawar. It took place in the year 1001. It was part of the Muslim conquest of northern India. And so what happened is Mahmud of Ghazni, on campaign from Afghanistan into India, attacked the Raja of Punjab, and the Raja was defeated. This took place outside of Peshawar. And so what we're going to do is assign the settlement nearest to where it took place, namely Peshawar, assign those coordinates to this battle. And you can see those coordinates here. So this map gives you a sense of the locations of the conflicts prior to the Columbian Exchange, the onset of the Columbian Exchange in 1500. And this map here gives you a sense of the conflict locations after 1500. I think the map that's most important is this one, which shows the change in conflict starts prior to the onset of the Columbian Exchange in 1500 and thereafter. And here on this map, the darker the shading indicates more conflict starts after the onset of the Columbian Exchange. And so we can observe that there's more conflict in South Asia. Also, it looks like in West Asia and then in East Asia. So just to give you a little bit of historical background here, the set of conflicts and actors in our data reflects the changing nature of conflict in Asia over the past millennium. So starting in the years 1000 to 1200, the major sources of conflict include the first three Holy Land Crusades, the Muslim conquest of northern India, which I mentioned before, and a variety of other wars. Moving to 1200 to 1500, the Mongols and their successors start to enter the data, as do conflicts relating to the Ming dynasty and the Delhi Sultanate. Between 1500 and 1700, conflict remains largely between Asians. For example, the Japanese invasion of Korea, the Mughal conquest of northern India, as well as Mughal conflicts with the Marathas and the Manchu conquest of China. And then from 1700 to 1900, conflicts involving Europeans start to enter the data. Things like the 7 Years' War, the Indian Mutiny, the first British-Afghan War. Okay, so now let's turn to the caloric suitability data. These data improve over past measures of land quality by taking potential caloric output into account. They're constructed using data from the Global Agroecological Zones Project, which reports expected rain-fed low-input crop yields based on soil quality and climate. And what Galore and Ozak do is convert these from tons per hectare per year to thousands of calories per hectare per year based on caloric data from the USDA. And they report these data separately for crops available before 1500, the quote unquote old world crops, and those available after 1500, the quote unquote new world crops. They report them as raster data, and we're going to average over raster points within each 1 degree by 1 degree grid cell. The way that the index varies over time within our data is primarily due to the introduction of new world crops, we're going to have data on caloric suitability for beans, cassava, coconut, groundnuts, maize, sunflower, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, and white potatoes. So this is a map that illustrates caloric suitability across Asia before the introduction of New World crops. This map illustrates the same caloric suitability data after the onset of the Columbian exchange. And again, what I think is the most important map is this one, which shows the change in caloric suitability due to the onset of the Columbian exchange after 1500. And here, again, the darker shadings means a greater increase in caloric suitability. So what we find is that these increases in caloric suitability are largely concentrated in South Asia and East Asia. Okay. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that these caloric suitability data are going to predict actual crop cultivation, at least in the year 2000. So the data that we have for actual crop cultivation are modern data. As I said, these data come from the year 2000. But in a regression in which we regress, for example, cultivation of the white potato in a grid cell in the year 2000 on the caloric suitability index, we find a positive and significant relationship. And that is, even if we're controlling for overall caloric suitability prior to the Columbian exchange and a bunch of geographic controls, including latitude, longitude, ruggedness, altitude, distance from the coast, and river presence. And as you can see here, this holds for all of the individual crops in our sample. Let me just provide an illustration of that. So this here, the top map shows caloric suitability according to the index for the white potato. And then the bottom map presents actual cultivation of the white potato in 2000. And so what you observe visually is a pretty strong correlation. Let's look at one other set of maps for another important grain, another important crop, which is maize. And so again, in this top map here, what we find is the Galore and Ozak caloric suitability index for each grid cell for maize. And then we find in the bottom map the actual cultivation of maize in Asia. And again, you see visually this pretty clear overlap. So let me give you a bit of historical background about the Columbian exchange now that I've introduced the data. Many of the new crops were tubers, things like white potatoes, sweet potatoes, and cassava. The main new grain was maize. And according to Crosby, these new crops complemented the old world crops by being grown in other seasons or on land that would otherwise be unproductive. Outside of India and China, maize arrived first in the Middle East by the 1500s. The Philippines were a major source of diffusion of New World crops to the rest of Asia. In China, it was the Spanish and Portuguese who introduced New World crops largely through Guangdong and Fujian. And in India, it was the Portuguese and Dutch who introduced most New World crops in regions around Goa, Surat, Cochin, and Bengal. It's important to point out here that diffusion of these New World crops in India was slower than it was in China. So let me now give you a sense of our main results. So in this table, we have two panels. The top panel is going to exclude the geographic controls, and then the bottom panel is going to include those geographic controls. And again, these are for latitude, longitude, ruggedness, altitude, distance from coast, and river presence of a grid cell interacted with a dummy for the post-1500 period. And then in columns 1 and 2 of both panels, we look at conflict starts for all conflicts. And then in columns 3 and 4, we look at conflict starts, limiting it to civil conflicts. And then the only difference between, say, column 1 and 2 or column 3 and 4 is that in column 2, we add in that interaction term between pre-1500 caloric suitability and the post-1500 dummy in order to help account for unobserved time varying heterogeneity among grid cells. So what you saw on the table is the following. The gain in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange significantly increased the number of conflicts, including civil conflicts. I've already given you one way to think about the magnitude at the outset. Let me now give you another way. A 1 standard deviation increase in caloric suitability increased conflict in a cell by 0.167 events in a century, compared with a standard deviation of 0.38. And roughly half of this magnitude comes from civil conflict. The coefficients aren't sensitive to geographic controls interacted with a post-1500 dummy, as you saw in that lower panel of the previous table. So another way to think about this is to perform event studies. And so what you find in this event study is that we don't observe any evidence of a pre-trend prior to the treatment, which is the onset of the Columbian exchange. After the onset of the Columbian exchange, what we observe is that in those places, in those grid cells in which that experienced an increase in caloric suitability, they were more likely to experience conflict. And notice each century, and notice that the coefficient magnitudes rise for the 1700s and 1800s. And the way we think about this is that this reflects the gradual diffusion of the New World crops throughout Asia. For robustness, we're also going to control for some potential confounders that could also affect this result. And this simply shows the event study when we restrict our sample of conflicts to civil conflicts. So I'm seeing a question here from Peter Solar, who says, are there other changes in agricultural technology that might have had major effects on caloric suitability after the onset of the Columbian exchange? I'm thinking of double cropping of rice. So that's an interesting question. Let me, for the time being, hold off on that, but I will describe some robustness checks that sort of get at that question. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about some of the robustness we do to test, how robust is this main result. So the first thing we're going to do is look at different sorts of standard errors. We're going to look at Conley standard errors with different cutoffs. We're also going to run a randomization inference exercise, first without any spatial restrictions and then with spatial restrictions. We're going to look at different estimators. So our outcome variable is a count variable with a fair amount of zeros. So we're going to look at a Poisson estimator with high dimensional fixed effects. We can also look at conflict incidence rather than conflict start. They're actually very highly correlated in our data. We can transform the outcomes as the natural log of 1 plus the outcome variable. We can include a lag dependent variable. We can include linear time trends for a variety of grid cell sizes. And we can also include country times century fixed effects. Another sort of robustness check that we can do is change the units of observation. We can increase cell sizes from 1 degree by 1 degree to 2 by 2, 3 by 3, and so on and so forth. Instead of using century time periods, we can use time periods of 50 years or 250 years. We can also think about alternative samples. We can restrict our sample to cells that experience a positive change in the caloric suitability index due to the Columbian exchange. Another thing we can do is discard cells in the bottom, the lowest quintile, the bottom 2 quintiles, or the bottom 3 quintiles of pre-1500 caloric suitability. And then another thing we can do to sort of try and reduce the effects of trade is to discard coastal and river cells. We can also think about additional controls. So staying with trade a little bit, we can interact trade routes in 1500 with that dummy variable for the post-1500 period. Similarly, we can interact the distance from the closest city prior to 1500 with that post-1500 dummy. We can think about a legacy of previous conflict by interacting conflicts prior to 1500 in a grid cell with a post-1500 dummy. And then we can also think about suitability for nomadic pastoralism in a grid cell and interact that as well. We can also think of different sets of conflicts. So one thing we do to sort of ensure that our results aren't driven by European imperialism, even if that can be an important mechanism, is to discard conflicts with at least one non-Asian participant. We can also discard conflicts with distant capitals of a participant, such as London or Paris. As I mentioned before, we can add additional conflicts for China, South Asia, and Turkey. And then we can discard conflicts with large numbers of battles. Things like the Indian Mutiny or the Taiping Rebellion. We can discard the number one conflict in terms of number of battles, the top three, as well as the top 10. So I do think, going back to Peter's question, I do think that some of these sorts of additional controls, sample restrictions, and additional controls for sort of unobserved time-varying heterogeneity help us get at some changes in sort of agricultural technology that can also confound our results. But this is something that we should maybe think about a little more explicitly. Okay, so let's now turn to mechanisms, and then I'll wrap things up. So the main mechanism, if you recall, that we think best explains our main result is a rapacity effect. And just so that we're all on the same page here, let me repeat the basic logic of this mechanism. So if we observe an increase in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange in certain areas, we might expect to observe increases in population and urbanization in those areas. And that might in turn increase the incentives of different political actors to gain control over the now more valuable contestable resources, which may in turn increase conflict. So that's the basic mechanism. And if that's true, then we might expect to observe a host of implications in the data. I already described all these implications. So now what I want to do is go to the results for these different implications and show you that we can actually verify that they appear to hold in our data. So let's first turn to urbanization and population. And so in this top panel here, what we're doing is putting population as our outcome variable or urbanization as the outcome variable, and we're regressing that on caloric suitability. And what we find in this top panel is that there is a positive and significant relationship between grid cells that experienced increases in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange and population and urbanization in those grid cells. Another way to look at this is to put population or urbanization as control variables in the main difference in difference specification. And what we find here is that both population and urbanization are associated with significantly more conflict starts. And also the coefficient magnitude on caloric suitability falls from the main specification. And so we perform a mediation analysis. This is quite speculative, but in any case, what it suggests is that population density mediates about 14% of the relationship between increases in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange and more conflict. And urbanization mediates about 21%. Okay, we can also look at imperialism. And so in this table, we measure imperialism in two ways. The first is at the modern country level, and the second is at the grid cell level. and whether a grid cell in a century was occupied by European empire. Here we're focusing on the British Empire, but for robustness, we do look at other European overseas empires. And so, again, we perform the same two sorts of exercises I showed you on the previous table. So in this top exercise here, we're going to put being part of an empire, the British Empire, as the outcome, and we find that places that experienced increases in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange are more likely to be part of the British Empire. They're more likely to be colonized. And then in this bottom set of tests here, what we're going to do is use empire status, being colonized by the British, as a control variable. And again, what we find is that being part of the British Empire is associated with more conflict starts. So taking these two sets of results together, we might conclude that those places that saw increases in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange were more likely to be violently occupied by British imperialists. Now, we can also look at results by regions. And what we find here is some evidence that East Asia is important to our results, and some evidence that West Asia is important to our results. But really, what appears to drive our results is South Asia. Okay, those are the most robust findings. And if you think about it, this makes sense, because South Asia, the Indian subcontinent primarily, on the eve of the Columbian exchange, was rife with political competition. There were a lot of rival states competing in that region, and therefore that's the sort of place we would be most likely to observe a rapacity effect. We can also look at our results by crop type, and what we find here is that it looks like a variety of crop types influence conflict starts. And so this also, we think, fits with the logic of the rapacity effect, namely that any sort of productivity enhancing New World crop can alter settlement patterns and thereby change the incentives of political actors to fight over certain territories. This is different, of course, than a state-making mechanism. If this was a state-making mechanism, we might find that maize, the introduction of maize in certain parts of Asia, is driving our results. And it would only be maize that would sort of have this significant impact on conflict starts. But that's not what we find.
Mark, you have a minute left.
Okay. So I will, I'm pretty close to being finished in any case. So let me wrap this up here. So we can also look at conflict types. And again, we find a variety of conflict types influence our results. And then we can also look at intra and intergroup diversity. Here we're going to take genetic diversity as a measure of intragroup diversity and ethnic diversity as a measure of intergroup diversity. And of course, this is speculative, because the diversity data we have are from the modern era, not from a historic period. But what we find is those places that saw increases in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange and were more diverse, either in terms of intra or intergroup relationships, do in fact experience more conflict. And so we view this as consistent with a rapacity mechanism, as I explained before. Okay, so I'm going to very briefly talk about this slide, and then I'm going to conclude. So let's think briefly about some alternative mechanisms. So going back to the opportunity cost mechanisms that's out there in the literature, if this was correct, then in our data, we ought to observe a decrease in conflict due to the higher opportunity cost of fighting relative to engaging in productive economic activity. However, of course, we document an increase in conflict. I've talked a bit about state making already. We don't find that greater conflict is most evident for crops that can be taxed. Indeed, we find that the introduction of tubers and vegetables due to the Columbian exchange were also associated with increases in conflict. Furthermore, we don't find that the increases in caloric suitability are associated with greater state presence, nor that whether state presence can predict conflict. And last thing here, I want to mention the moderation of weather shocks. So like Jaw's important 2014 paper, we do find that greater caloric suitability dampens the link between weather shocks and conflict. However, overall, we find that the introduction of the sweet potato is associated with more conflict. So that suggests to us that there must be some other mechanism that offsets conflict dampening in Asia as a whole. And then the results for inequality are rather inconclusive. Okay, so just to wrap things up here, just taking a step back, what we find in this paper is that an increase in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange was associated with greater conflict in the context of Asia. The standardized effect size is meaningful. We argue that a rapacity effect, which in short means a rise in the gains from appropriation through violence, best explains this result. We also find that this increase in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange was associated with significantly greater violent occupation by the British imperialists. So overall, we think that this paper sheds some new light on how a permanent positive productivity shock can impact conflict, and also it sheds some new light perhaps on the great divergence in historical socioeconomic outcomes in which imperialism arguably played an important role. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Please indicate whether you'd like to ask a question either by raising your hand or by putting a remark in the Q&A. Let's see. Okay, we have one in the Q&A. This is a clarifying question. Can a conflict resources involve many battles located in different cells?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. So the way, let me go back to the example here. So if you look at this example, this is the Battle of Peshawar, which is associated with the broader war of the Muslim conquest of northern India. So for us, each conflict event is a battle, and it's in one place. And so we don't look at broader wars here. We break down each war by the battles that took place, and of course, we sort of focus on the prime location, right? And so in this case, it's quite easy. It looks like it took place outside of Peshawar, so that's the grid cell it's located in. So to sort of follow up on that, let's look at the results for different conflict types. And so interestingly, it does look like land-based battles, whether they're classic land battles or sieges, storming and sacking are variations on sieges. They appear to drive the results. Naval battles don't appear to drive our results, and maybe that's not surprising. On the other hand, we kept the naval battles in our data because it is possible that with greater productivity, then it would be easier. You'd have more foodstuffs to bring to sea, and that might increase conflict even at sea. But we don't really find that naval battles matter, and I don't think that's surprising. So thank you for your question.
Yeah. So we have a number of others. I have in the chat, Gustavo, and please excuse me if I get your name wrong, and I'll allow you to talk. So ask to unmute. So Gustavo Albuquerque, please
Okay,
ask.
so
Hello, good afternoon. My question is a bit of a suggestion, but I mean, also a question if whether you have done it. So from your talk, I understand that you have a good notion of how these new crops dispersed or at least where they arrived.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if the effects were supposed to be higher on places that are closer to where they arrived, especially in the beginning. So I was thinking that maybe for the first century, maybe run these regressions for each century and interact caloric suitability with the place where they first arrived and or the distance with the place they first arrived. And if they, well, we should see something like closer places get bigger effects, and this difference gets smaller as they spread over. And I mean, if you have more detailed, even more detailed data than where they start, I mean, I think there's even more to be done. But yeah, that's kind of question / suggestion.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think that's a great suggestion. We haven't done that, but that's certainly something we can look at. So thank you.
All right, we have a large number of questions in the Q&A, so let's try to move apace. So let me ask, and again, pardon me if I mispronounce your name, Kailak Wong, what are the country and century fixed effects enough to capture the heterogeneous pace of technological development in transportation?
Yeah, so I don't know if they're enough, but we do try and do other things. So of course, one thing we do is we interact trade routes, the location of trade routes in 1500 with a dummy for the post 1500 period. I'm not sure if that really gets at your question, but let me show you something else that we do, which is we're going to control for linear trends for different size grid cells. And so this is a way to pick up sort of unobserved time varying heterogeneity, including changes in technology, transportation technology at a pretty fine grain level. So we can look at trends for 2x2 cells or 3x3, 4x4, 5x5. What we find is that the main results for conflict starts hold even if we're controlling for that. So that's one way maybe to get at this. The civil conflict starts, the results still are statistically significant if we control for trends for 5° by 5° cells, but thereafter they do lose significance.
Okay, I have a question for Peter Solar. If I understand correctly, for each cell you have a measure of caloric suitability before and after. Do these changes measure the time period based on information on the actual adoption of crops? For example, maize only starts to be adopted in China in the 18th century, and white potatoes really don't get cultivated there until the 20th century.
Yeah.
So you could go for actual diffusion.
Right, right. So we only have data for pre-1500 and post-1500 in terms of caloric suitability. We don't have data on the actual adoption time. If you recall, I did show some maps and some regression results that showed the correlation between caloric suitability of a grid cell and actual cultivation in the year 2000. And you do find that there is a positive and significant relationship between those two variables. But no, we don't have specific data on the time of adoption in a grid cell, although that would be awesome.
Okay, Tobias Korn, thinking about the state military capacity channel you mentioned, wouldn't the suitability of the perpetrator's home location matter more than the conflict location? Do your sources allow you to geocode the perpetrator's home locations and power centers?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that what this question gets at is this idea that if, say, the British are lacking in something, then some sort of crop, then they're going to go somewhere else where they have that crop to get it. So, I mean, the first, general point is simply, I think it's, pretty fair to say that imperialists such as the British were sort of incentivized to look externally because they just didn't have these things on the British Isles. But I think that's something that we could look at. So yes, we can geocode the perpetrator's home location. So for every conflict, we have identified the capital city of each participant. So I think we can do something like that.
Well, so let me ask, you have things like tobacco, tea, opium that are not caloric, cotton, which are not caloric. And tobacco and tea at least have, or tobacco and cotton at least have a New World component.
Yes.
Do those affect your results at all?
Yeah, good point. I'll have to think about that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. We do, we are controlling for grid cell fixed effects, which might sort of be associated with the propensity to cultivate tobacco or cotton. But yeah, we should think about that.
So I have a question that popped up. Oh, wait a minute here. Chris Meisner. Hi, Mark. I was wondering if you could discuss the cost of adoption of the new crops and more generally the micro and macroeconomics of adoption and diffusion. You mentioned the slow diffusion process. What do you think the correlates of diffusion are?
Hi, Chris. So this is something I think we need to think about more. I mean, I think it's a good point. Yeah, no, I think we should think about this more. Thank you.
So I have Juan Marejo Cruz. Is the assumption underlying the identification that the battles in one cell do not affect battles in an adjacent cell? I see you use Conley errors, but I am thinking more about spatial interactions across cells. Are the results robust to different cell sizes, or can you think of spatial difference in difference?
Yeah, so as Juan points out, we do use Conley standard errors for robustness. We also do look at different grid cell sizes. So let me show you that here. This. Okay, so these are the results for different grid cell sizes, including 5 degree by 5 degree cells. So this sort of gets at Juan's question. We also use these randomization exercises with some sort of spatial limits that sort of get at that as well.
Okay, Kim has a question. Presumably countries which see a high population as a result of the Columbian exchange become a more attractive target, but could also find it easier to attack a neighbor. Does your analysis take account of who initiates the conflict? Also, do you control for French and British empires?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So the first thing is, we don't really know who initiates a conflict, but we know the participants in each conflict. So what you're sort of pointing out is I think that in some ways it's the state-making mechanism, but we really don't find robust evidence for a state-making mechanism here. Do we control for the French and British empires? We do. So let me show you those results. Okay, so these are all the European empires, and I've shown you the results for the British. And so here's the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and any that's driven by the British. So really, I can talk about these results in a bit more detail, but the upshot is that it's really the British Empire which is driving these results. And in some ways that makes sense. I mean, the British were the sort of the dominant empire in Asia. But if we just look at the French results, that we don't find any relationship between increases in caloric suitability due to the Columbian exchange in a grid cell and French imperial occupation. Now, interestingly, we do find that the French were more likely to experience conflict. Conflict was more likely to occur in places that the French how can I put this? There's a positive and significant relationship between places that experience increases in caloric suitability and conflict that involved the French. Okay, but if we really want to think about imperialism, we'd expect that both these tests would sort of be passed, and it's only the British that really pass both these tests.
Okay. I have a question from David Mitch related to your findings on the Great Divergence question. I'm unclear as to whether you view conflicts as being good or bad. And there may be a presumption that they're bad, but insofar as conflicts reflect more political composition or competition, there could be positive effects for growth. So do you have a?
Well, I'd have to think about this a little bit. Obviously, conflict is a bad thing. We want peaceful resolution of our differences whenever possible. What we think is kind of interesting is that with respect to the literature, which tends to emphasize how positive productivity shocks can reduce conflict, we're actually finding the opposite. And that does seem to be associated with British imperialism. And so in this way, sort of the introduction of New World crops is also linked to imperialism, which can be associated with the implementation of extractive institutions and can lead to divergent socioeconomic outcomes.
All right, one last question here, and I wholly approve of this question. Not from me, it's from Alexander. Perhaps I got lost, but what is the basis of the FAO crop suitability before 1500 and current land yields post 1500? Isn't FAO suitability a measure based on current conditions on the Earth system of the 1990s? There's a little age of ice affecting land suitability by mean of temperatures and droughts. So perhaps you're measuring changes between 1800 and 2000. I hope I got that right.
Yeah, No, I mean, I think that there is this question about these data. I mean, Paul, do you have something that you'd like to add about this? Because I know that you have some doubts about these data too.
I don't think they have been checked. I know in the US context, like people use the cotton numbers and they are completely wrong. They suggest you cannot grow cotton in Alabama and you can in East Kansas and Iowa, and they're just not, they just haven't been checked against the historical record. So there's something to them, but I would not put the weight on them that people do.
Okay. So I think that's really good to know. And so I think that the best way to sort of address this question is just say, let's take a second look at this and see if we can come up with some additional ways to sort of validate their credibility. And if not, maybe we can think about some alternative ways to do these tests.
Right. So we're at 5 or 6 p.m. In the location of origin. And so let's thank the speaker, and anybody who wants to stay on, please feel free to stay on for the next 15 minutes or so. So thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this paper on behalf of my co-authors.
All right.
Nathan, is there any way I can like take a sort of get these question and answers so I have them?
Sure. We have them, and we'll send them to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, I had a comment, if I can, sort of.
Yes, please. Yeah.
One comment or observation, and another is a question, maybe.
Mhm.
So one take of your paper, provided everything else is fine,
Mhm.
is related to the reversal of fortune literature. So to the extent that this is just a marketing thing for the paper, but you're basically reversing the reversal of fortune, in the sense, if America had this bounty in terms of agricultural products that made it attractive for extractive, the Acemoglu, Robinson, Johnson paper. So now you're transferring this benefit to Asia, and that creates sort of a reversal of the reversal, which is, I mean, just something to think about in terms of putting this paper in the literature. That's more of a comment than a question. The question is, how do you actually deal with this confounding effect of inequality and state making? Because in the paper, it depends on the crop to some extent, but they have these opposite effects. And so when you're using your robustness regressions and getting insignificant inequality, it could be an average of a positive and a negative effect, depending on the crop, depending on the effect of state making. So is there a way to disentangle this so we can rule out this, if it was just a one-way, if sort of the derivative was either positive or negative, then obviously your findings show can reject this hypothesis. But if the derivative ex ante is dependent on all kinds of things, it could be either positive or negative. The fact that it's insignificant doesn't mean that it's not operating.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the other thing is the way we measure inequality is based on caloric suitability, whereas the arguments are really about class inequality. And so that's another problem. It's hard to think about the best way. So the mechanisms, I think, make logical sense. It's hard to think about a good way to test them with the data we have. We'll think about it more, I guess.
You don't have any direct data on state capacity. I mean, I know you dealt with this in the European context, but you have no direct evidence on.
Well, we do. So let me show you. Where did I put those data? Okay. So we have this state antiquity index. And so this is by Putterman and co-authors. And so, we don't really find a whole lot here. So for example, this is our main difference in difference specification. The main results go through, and having a longer state history doesn't seem to predict conflict in this context, for example. So that's one additional test we do that I didn't talk about.
Yeah, that's historical, but not the making. Like if a state becomes, after the Columbian exchange,
right,
you have state making, new state making, or stronger.
Yeah. That's
anyway,
what we have.
It's just,
I mean, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we had a question.
I do. I had several, but let me focus on one. Right. So I think I want to believe your results. Right. So there's a productivity shock, has unexpected outcome in the sense that it leads to increasing conflict. I'm also equally puzzled as David Mitch whether this was ultimately good or bad. So I guess this would be the Eric Jones Hoffman version or question for your paper, right? European miracle based on endemic warfare turned out to be a good thing for all sorts of reasons. But what I want to ask, there was another productivity shock, a very big one, around the same time. And this was the productivity shock in military technology, right? So Portuguese got guns to Japan in 1543. The Mughals were buying them from the Ottomans in the 16th century. The prices of guns, as far as I understand, the relative price of guns was going down, perhaps less so in Asia than in Europe, but it was going down. So in a sense, maybe this productivity shock increased the value of starting a conflict, but starting a conflict also became much cheaper, at least in productivity terms. And if you have enough state capacity that you can arm or that you can raise a firearm army, then you would have an advantage to get into the conflict relative to before. So it looks like that there's two productivity shocks simultaneously.
Right.
Which one? How would we know which one was the important one?
Yeah, no. So I was looking at my notes because we have something about this in the paper, so I wanted to refresh my memory. I mean, the first thing is, for what it's worth, we do try and control for local trends that might help account in some way for sort of time-varying unobserved shocks, such as changes in agricultural productivity or changes in military technology. But taking a step back, I mean, here's what we've sort of written here. Gunpowder and firearms were invented in China in the 9th century. They spread across Eurasia. Piercing and cutting weapons were also commonplace. And so what Hoffman is going to argue is that it was really these enduring differences in the geopolitical context across Eurasia that help explain why military technology advanced in early modern Europe, less so in other places. And so we don't, we sort of think that we don't expect the Columbian exchange to really sort of, provide greater access to new military technology, because a lot of that technology had been developed in Asia. And then there's other local geopolitical reasons why it didn't develop further in Asia versus Western Europe. But yeah.
Yeah, I take your point, right? But I think this is a variation on Hoffman's argument, right? So he wants to explain why technology, despite the fact that gunpowder was invented in China, it was actually developed in Europe. But after that development, it was exported as a traded good back to Asia, right? And in the case of Japan, it's very clear that there was a big increase in conflict associated with firearms. Don't know about India, right? But they were furiously buying guns from the Ottomans. That was a big initial advantage of the Mughals that probably allowed them to, conquer the whole north of India. So and it's the fact that both of these productivity shocks happen at the same time. So
yeah, right? No. So I think maybe we could think of a clever way to sort of disentangle these two things. I don't know how, but maybe we can think about that. Yeah.
Okay.
So Peter Solar had some questions in the Q&A, so maybe I'll allow him to ask. So I'll ask him to unmute if he is. Did that work, Peter? No, that didn't work. So anybody else? Okay, here's one.
I think Peter left, but I can read. Oh no, he's there. I can read these questions off if you want.
Okay, so I'll ask him to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Every time I run into these gas suitability figures for crops that I know a lot about, they turn out to be very unrelated to the historical reality. For example, Ireland turns out to be largely unsuitable for the growth of the potato. So if you can find some way of either validating or invalidating the GAES suitability index, that would be a useful contribution in itself, because this seems to be used all over the place, and I really don't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Not a question, more a comment.
Yeah, no, I take your point.
I'll chime in here if I may. I'll take the prerogative. So yes, I have in the U.S. They collected numbers in 1850 and 1860 on potential crop yields per acre. Gavin Wright initially collected them. He gave what he did to me. I've been going around and collecting them. The suitability indices, as best I know, it's sort of like wheat can capture, explain corn yields better than this guy's corn yield numbers explain them. So there's some information content in there about the general suitability of an area for agriculture, but the differences, and that's what people rely on, don't seem to check out based on 1850 and 1860 county level data. So, yeah, take that for what you will.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
No. I'm going to take this into account.
Are there other questions?
Not a question, Roy again here, but picking back on Chris Meissner's idea of what diffusion processes might be. So I was thinking about economies of scale, right? Which of these crops required larger plots to be profitable and to be above the minimum efficient scale, and also about property rights, right? Because I guess if this productivity shock makes certain territories more suitable for higher yielding crops, you first need to change the land usage, and that might depend on the structure of the property rights, whether you as it were, need to enclose the fields, or it's okay for you to subdivide them. It has to do with the local labor market. So could this be ways to think about why diffusion might be faster in some places than others?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, clearly access, access to trade routes, I think might also be a way. But that's related in some ways to state capacity too. Yeah, no, we should think about this more.
All right, we have just moments remaining. David Mitch has a question.
Yeah, if you can hear me, hopefully, yeah. I just want to follow up a little bit on this sort of distinction between the rapacity versus the sort of the state building. And one way I was sort of thinking about it was in terms of the old Mansur-Olson distinction between roving and stationary bandits. And one way of thinking of it is this increased productivity. Well, on the one hand, it gives the rapacity effect is sort of the incentive for roving bandits. On the other side of it, if this is a long-term productivity shock, it provides more incentive for the stationary bandit to set in place and provide sort of more enduring protection. And that's sort of an offsetting thing. And you are sort of, in a way, empirically, you're trying to establish that, but I was just going to suggest that way of thinking about what might be going on. I mean, one of the things that's bothering me when I asked about the sort of conflict issue is you don't really right now have a very rich specification in terms of what's going on in terms of state activity and state structure. You mentioned colonialism, other things, but that plays out in very different ways in different parts of Asia.
Yeah, thank you for this. Now that you sort of put it like that, I mean, I don't know if we call it state making. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, actually, because rapacity is a form of, it involves political actors and therefore it involves states. So I think that we're in a better place with this than we were with the first round of revisions. But yeah, I don't think we're there yet. We kind of haven't really pinned this down completely. So yeah, maybe we can think about this roving versus stationary bandits.
All right, so we're at time. Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause again, and thank you so much for participating.
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Paul, for moderating.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Very good, Mark.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
Very interesting.
Thank you
for asking me to do this. It's a change of pace.
And I hope to come to more of the Econ Hist seminars. The timing
Yeah.
is tough this semester, but
Sure, yeah. Okay, well, Naomi's giving a talk, so be sure to, with a
yeah,
paper with.
no, I need to come. I'm the
Yeah.
director of graduate studies now.